So one of my favorite agnostics, that is somebody who's not sure whether they believe in a God, told me this story about the one time he went to church as a child before he started going occasionally with me. Some aunt took him to her church when he was a little boy, and he went with his friend, a school friend. And they actually didn't go to church, they went to the Sunday school. So they were put in the Sunday school, and some kid's grandmother was teaching Sunday school, and she told children a story from the Bible, and then asked the children to relate it to their lives, to tell stories from their lives like the story about the person in the Bible. And he said to me, "I do not understand why you people read stories from thousands of years ago and expect it to have anything to do with your life." I hope to show to you this morning why we do it. I want to start with a story that John wrote down that is actually Mary's story and the story of John and Peter, but primarily Mary Magdalene. On that morning, she's going back to take care of the body that they could not embalm properly on Good Friday, and she is frantic when she sees the empty tomb. She thinks that somebody has taken Jesus' body away, either for nefarious reasons or just because they wanted to move him around. And so she runs and tells the disciples, and Peter and John come running. Interestingly, John doesn't go into the tomb, and Peter, who comes behind him, charges into the tomb, and they see the empty tomb. They don't quite get what's happening, but it says they saw and believed. But believed what? Because it said, as of yet, they did not understand that he was to rise from the dead. Well, then Mary stays crying, wanting to know where he is, and then she hears her name being called. And remember that she turns around. She first thought he was a gardener and said, "Where is he? What have you done with him?" And then Jesus says her name. And when he says her name, she recognizes him. Now, it could be that she just had cognitive dissonance. She didn't recognize Miss Jesus because Jesus was dead. She had just seen him dead, and so she couldn't possibly believe that that was Jesus in front of her. But it could also be that he's slightly changed, because there are things about her story that are very like all the other stories that people told about seeing Jesus in the 50 days after he rose from the dead. They all remember, most of them remember, being called by name. That he says their name: Mary, Thomas, Peter, John. He actually calls them by name. That's one of the things they all have in common. The other thing, and this is throughout all of the resurrection stories through the four Gospels, every one of them sees a real physical Jesus, a person they can touch, a person who asks to be fed and eats in front of them, a person who cooks for them. They can hear his voice. He is not an apparition. And notice in the story today that Mary says, here we go again, that Mary saw two angelic figures, two hazy white figures, and then she saw a gardener, a man. And he actually says, "Don't touch me," for whatever reason, we don't know. I'm not going there today. "Don't touch me, I'm going to the Father." But that meant he was touchable. He was a physical being. The other thing that is true across many of the stories is that he's unrecognized until he says something to them, either by calling them by name, or in the story of the Gospel of Luke on the road to Emmaus, he has a whole conversation with them, and then he has a meal with them and breaks bread with them, and all of a sudden they go, "Oh, you're the risen Jesus." And the other fascinating thing is that he addresses them personally. Now, if you think about all the things you've heard from Jesus in the past few months, he's telling parables addressed to anybody. Once there was a master in a vineyard, once there was a servant, once there was a mustard seed, or he's got these beatitudes. But in all of the encounters with the risen Jesus, he is speaking to the individuals. Thomas, see and believe. Mary, go and tell. Peter, stop whining and do what I'm telling you to do. He talks to each of them individually, to their personalities. It's an intimate, personal, risen Jesus. And one of the reasons we recount this story is that even to this day, people come to hear this story and feel, some of us, a shiver of excitement that we are remembering the risen Jesus. But just as important, we experience the risen Jesus. We have what we call God moments, and we often share stories with one another in the same way, which is why Sunday school teachers ask children to relate the story to their lives. So I'm going to share a God story moment that comes from my friends Carl and Jeanette, who are live streaming with us today. Everybody turn and wave hi to Carl and Jeanette. It was the Dorseys. They went to church with me and the Dorseys in Sacramento, so we're saying hi. Jeanette told me this story. She and I would go skiing on Fridays in the Sierra Nevada. And as we were driving to skiing one day, I told her a God moment story of my own. And then she said, I have an amazing story for you. And she told me Carl's story that Carl had told to her. Now, you need to know that Carl is legally blind. He went on a medical mission trip to Kodera, Kenya, with some medical missionaries, medical people. And Carl, who's a lawyer, said, look, I'll just provide support. I want to go. And as they were in a compound one night, it was dark out, they were working in a pharmacy, sort of working on organizing supplies in the pharmacy, when suddenly armed assailants came in with guns, knocked people about the heads with the guns, and said, we're going to rob you, and then we're going to kill you. Carl was not seeing a lot, but felt a gun in his back. And right at that moment, he thought two things: I'm going to die. And he felt a sudden, complete peace pass over him. Complete calm, complete peace. And he knew that that came from God. He said everybody, they were a bunch of Christians from a church in Washington, they all started praying, some of them aloud. Carl prayed silently, and he said his prayer was, God, take care of Jeanette and the children. He has 3 children. Other people were praying aloud. They were knocked down on the ground, a lot of them, and one woman said very loudly aloud, Dear God, please keep them from finding the passports. And Carl was thinking, why the heck would you pray that out loud? But in fact, they opened a bunch of drawers. They robbed everybody of their money. They robbed money from the pharmacy, but they did not find the passports. Then somebody said, we got to run. We got to get out of here. Oh, Carl can't see much in the light and definitely can't see in the dark. So he was running literally through the dark in the compound until one of the assailants saw him running, knocked him to the ground with a rifle butt and said, stop. So Carl waited on the ground in the dark until finally somebody said, Carl, you've got to get out of here. So Carl got up and just stumbled until he found a building and crawled into the corner of a building. Finally, people came to get them, and they said that there were a bunch of people from the city who had gathered clubs and sticks and tools, whatever they could find, 200 people, and were protecting them because the word had got out that they were trying to kill the missionaries. So Carl says this is a God moment for him. That moment of peace when the gun was in his back, the woman's prayer working so they didn't find the passports, the most difficult thing to replace, and the people coming to save them. He experienced the peace that surpasses understanding. He experienced salvation and deliverance from his oppressor. It's as good a story as the Hebrews being led out of Egypt, isn't it? Now, here's the thing. I'm pretty sure that when Carl first told the story to Jeanette, she did not feel joy or amazement. When I first heard it, I said, Carl should not go on any more trips. That was my reaction. But as Jeanette was telling me the story, you could see the amazement on her face as she recounted his God moment. And then she turned to me and I said, wow, that's amazing. I experienced amazement, and I was hearing it third hand, Carl to Jeanette to me. I'll give you another one from people. Now, those are all 3 faithful people. I'll give you another story from 2 people who called themselves atheists. My friends Dina and Nick. Nick was my high school English teacher. Dina, his wife, and they knew me well when I was in high school. And a few years ago, Nick was very sick with stage 4 lung cancer, and he was not going to live very much longer. And all of a sudden, he wanted to talk with his friend, the priest, about God. Now, this was nothing about heaven, the afterlife. he had wonderings about God. He kept having these stirrings. And he kept saying, he said, I keep wondering. He didn't know what he was wondering about. And so I answered a few of his questions about how I experience God. None of these conversations happened with his wife. She knew they were happening. One time I flew up to visit him in person, and we went off into a room and talked, and she said, oh, you're having your God talk with him, aren't you? I said, yes. Well, after he died, she felt compelled to talk to me, still not religious, and told me this story, that on the last night of his life, he was in the hospital, she was sitting next to him, and she fell asleep in the chair. And when she woke up, Nick was awake, and he was smiling and looking off in the corner. And she said, why are you smiling? And he said, there is an angel sitting in that corner, and we are talking. She said, what are you saying? And he said, I don't know, but we're talking. Now, if anybody's ever heard about like conversations with God, they're usually not, English to English, Italian, Spanish. It's usually some kind of a thing going on, a silent communication. And she felt that she had to call me and tell me that story. And she said, isn't that weird? And I said, yeah, isn't that amazing? Just like Mary, he sees an angel. There is a way to practice seeing God. My working theory is that God, risen Christ, whatever, is present all the time, probably in this room, probably sitting right there, I don't know. Definitely in the bread and wine. And that some of us are more trained to see it than others. Maybe God is more obvious around the world. They want to make the world better. It has inspired saints to build hospitals and schools and churches and orphanages and to do amazing things. And on a personal level, these stories give people comfort and strength and resilience and peace and, frankly, emotional well-being. But I think for people who don't have access to these stories, instead what they hear is stuff in the media, negative stories about churches or synagogues or mosques, about people turning religion, using it as an evil instrument to justify war or the mistreatment of other people or theft of money or whatever. But for most of us, these conversations are going on in cars on the way to ski trips, or in cafes, or at the Thanksgiving dinner table, or at a funeral, or at your softball game. They're just short, brief exchanges between people when somebody says, I need to tell you something that happens. And then the person who listens says, wow, that's weird. Wow, that's amazing that happened. We've actually been practicing doing this in our Embracing Evangelism series that we had as our adult forum for the past few weeks, and people were sharing stories with one another. We were practicing listening to them, and we were practicing receiving them. And what we discovered is that in the sharing of them, that in itself becomes another God moment. I'll give you yet another example. I was leading the session that day. People were asked to pair up and share a moment in which they felt God's presence. Everybody paired up. I had already thought of a story in my mind, but I wasn't going to pair up with anybody unless somebody needed me. And my story was about experiencing a deep closeness to God in the middle of childbirth, and not the fun part of childbirth, the other part of childbirth. And yet, for some reason, I felt a deep connection right then. I am connected to all of creation. I am perpetuating the generations. Well, Lawrence was looking around for somebody to share his story with, and I said, here, Jim, we can do it. What's your story? And he said, it's about childbirth. It's about the moment when my first grandchild was put in my arms, and I felt that deep connection to everything and realized that the generations were being perpetuated again, and I was part of creation. And I said, wow, isn't that amazing that we had the same story and you were looking for someone to tell it to, and it was somebody with the exact same story. It shouldn't surprise us. Jesus said, I will always be with you. And these stories that we tell, this is the ongoing record that started with Mary Magdalene and continues to this day of people experiencing the risen Christ in our midst. Isn't it amazing? We have seen God. Happy Easter.